Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my book review of the book Harm's Way by David Mack. This is a new Star Trek novel in the original series, timeline, and era. What's interesting about this book is that it ties into the whole Star Trek Vanguard series, which is really fun to talk about. And I'll go ahead and tip my hat. This is my favorite Vanguard novel now. I've only read half the Vanguard novels, but so far, this is my favorite of the ones I've read. So, Star Trek has really slowed down publishing in the last couple of years. They had been doing in the 90s up to 24 books a year, 2 books a month. Then in the 2000s, they dropped down. They started doing only about 1 book a month. And they kept that from the 2000s through the beginning and middle of the 2010s. And then somewhere around 2018, when the license went from Simon & Schuster's pocketbooks to gallery books, they decided to slow it down even further. And they were doing like 4, 5, 6 books a year instead of 12. Now, in 2021, we had like 9 books come out, but that's because of a multitude of issues. Part of it was they had several original series and next-gen books ready, but it was also because they had the big trilogy, the Coda trilogy that they had to do, and so then there were a few other things. So they had a lot more than normal. But now they've dropped down and they're doing like maybe 3 or 4 a year, which is a real crying shame. The last book that we got was Star Trek Second Self by Una McCormick, which I reviewed on the channel, which was, to me, a letdown. It wasn't a bad book, it just was mediocre, and I was very disappointed, especially since we had to wait almost 9 months between the last Star Trek novel and this one. Well, the wait difference this time is only about a little more than 3 months, and so we finally got Harm's Way. And boy, is this an entertaining book. I'm so thrilled with this book. This is, I can say, the best Star Trek novel we've gotten in 2022. But that's an easy competition because there's only 2 books that came out. I guess if you count the audio drama, but that didn't come out in print, so I can't read it. So what I really enjoyed about this book is it nails everything it needs to nail. Everything from the tone, to the pacing, to the plot, to the characters. Everything is just nailed. It's perfect in all those regards. There are things about it I may not particularly love, but it does them so well from like a storytelling perspective that I respect it and I'm very pleased with it. But let's talk first about the Vanguard series. If you don't know, from about 2005-ish to about 2012, Star Trek produced this limited series of books called the Vanguard series. And it had a couple of authors. David Mack wrote he wrote 4 of the novels, and then Dayton Ward and Kevin Dillmore, who's a writing duo, they wrote 3 of the novels, and then there was a novella collection book that had novellas from all 3 of those gentlemen, plus their editor, Marco Palmieri. So there were 8 books in the Vanguard series, and then there is a little novella, ebook novella that takes place afterwards. But for right now, we'll talk about 8 books, like print books. I have all of those books on my shelves, and I've read the first 4, and I intend to read the second 4 eventually. But this book takes place right about in the middle, around book 5 in that series. And so one question I think a lot of people are going to ask is, do I have to have read the Vanguard series to understand this book? And I'm going to say no. There are certainly things in this book that might, I wouldn't say spoil, but they might reveal information from the Vanguard series that takes longer to understand. And so you'll feel you know more. In the Vanguard series, when it begins, you start with no knowledge, and they're slowly revealing it to you. But if you read this book, a lot of that knowledge you already know because it's in this book. But I wouldn't say it's spoilers, because it really doesn't spoil much. I don't think that you will read this and then be like, and try to read the old Vanguard books and be like, oh man, now it's not fun anymore. I think that this book actually will enhance your enjoyment a little bit. But I read the first 4 books, and of the first 4, none of them stood out to me that I liked. The first book, Harbinger, I thought was okay. I didn't love it. I didn't dislike it, really. The second book, Summon the Thunder, was not entertaining at all. Reap the Whirlwind was okay, and Open Secrets was okay. Like, all the books were just okay, and so I never felt this drive to finish them, despite the fact that I own all of them. I've always been like, I'll read that next year, and I just never do. And Harm's Way comes out, and I read this now because it's a new Star Trek novel, and I wanted to read it so that I could review it, get the discussion out there, and promote new Trek books, because we need more Star Trek novels. We need to do more. We need to prove that we will buy the books, and this one's at least worth it. But I picked up this book, and it was just a delightful experience. David Mack is one of those authors that you hear a lot about him because, A, he's written a ton of Star Trek novels. He's up there. You have Peter David, David Mack, and Dayton Ward. They have all written like 30-plus novels. They have extensive history with Star Trek. Put the three of them together, I don't think there's any other combination of three authors that has as many novels as them. And so they wrote a ton of Star Trek novels. Then you have, so that's one reason why David Mack gets a lot of discussion. Another reason he gets a lot of discussion is a lot of people like his books. Other than Peter David, I don't know any other author who has as many fans that say, this is my favorite Star Trek author. If you do polls of fans, I think that the largest number will say Peter David because he was there for so long in the fandom. But then I think that David Mack would be a close second for people saying he's their number one author, that they love him that much. In fact, my friends, my friends here where I live, who got me into reading Star Trek books, they said David Mack's the best. And that's why I picked up David Mack books in the first place. And I've had, a complicated relationship. Some of his books I think are brilliant. Some of his books are highly entertaining. And he's had a few that I've thought were mediocre. But actually, the only mediocre books by David Mack that I've read were his Vanguard series and also his Cold Equations first book. I thought that the rest of his books, his book in the fall is my favorite book of his. His book from the what's it called? His books in the Destiny trilogy were fantastic. His books in the A Time 2 series were the best, some of the best books in the A Time 2 series. So he's written, and of course, his book in Coda was really good. But he's written some great books and some mediocre books, and I picked up this book hoping it would be on the great side, and it absolutely was. So let's talk about the different areas of what makes this book so great. And let's begin with the pacing. This does not feel like a TV episode to me. Maybe to other people, like, they think it feels like a long TV episode, but it actually got more vibes of one of the TOS movies. The pacing of how the beginning of the book unfolds, how the middle action scenes unfold, and how the end action scenes unfold. All of it felt very movie quality to me, not TV. And I prefer the movies over the television. But another reason of that pacing is a lot of the plot in this book reminds me of The Search for Spock. Because obviously, as you can tell from the cover image, there are Klingons in this book. That's not a spoiler. There are Klingons in this book. And the stuff with the Klingons really reminds me of the way the Klingons are treated and used in The Search for Spock. So I really liked that angle in this book. I also, and there's actually, I didn't even put this in my written review, but there's actually some similarities to how the Klingons are used in Generations. But I'll say specifically Search for Spock is what this reminded me. And then some of the plot reminded me of Search for Spock. So I really like that movie. It's not my favorite Trek movie, but it's, I think, the most underrated Trek movie. It's the one that people hate on that shouldn't hate on. It's the best of the odd-numbered movies, in my opinion. But this book has great pacing throughout. The beginning takes a long time to set up the middle and end, but it's so worth it that you can overlook how slow it begins. But then once it picks up, it stays picked up. There is never a dull moment from when when they set out to do the rescue mission. This whole book is about a rescue mission. The scientists are on this planet and they send out a distress call, and they're in the neutral zone. So the Enterprise goes to go get them, but also the Klingons are going into the neutral zone because there's Federation in the neutral zone, and then of course you have some Operation Vanguard stuff from the Vanguard series happening. So it like all comes in at once, and just all of it hits ahead. That's the basic pitch of the book. Once that starts, once the Enterprise goes into the neutral zone, it never lets up till the end of the book. And the action I thought was great, the developments, and the world building was fantastic. The world building in this book felt like classic 60s and 70s sci-fi movies in some ways. There's actually a movie I was thinking of while I was reading this book, and I couldn't put my finger on the name of the movie. But it just, when I read this, I could picture that movie, and I could picture the sci-fi world building of the era, and it just was delightful. And also, I really enjoyed the way that they utilized humor with the world building as well. And I also really enjoyed how you had the Federation characters dealing with situations, and then you had the Klingons, and it shows how their cultures do things so vastly differently. Of course, as you would guess from the cover, the person who gets the most character time in this book is Spock, and he's handled really well. He gets a lot of deep thoughts in this book, particularly about the dissemination of information, and he starts the book thinking, all information is good information because learning is good and withholding information is bad. And there are things that happen in this book that lead Spock to realize maybe sometimes it is good to withhold information. And you see this really great character journey. And it's not like he changes 180, but he starts questioning things. He starts thinking about them more because of the events of this book, which I think are really good. There are some predictable moments, but I would argue that that's a good thing. I would argue that the predictable moments in here, they're predictable because David Mack sets up everything perfectly, because he does the work to make sure that all your plot devices are set up properly. And there were two in particular. One has to do with what happens with the Federation and the Klingons on the planet, but it also has to do with some revelations about the scientists that they're looking for. And of course, I'm not going into spoilers. So both of those revelations made total sense and I saw coming, but I thought they were executed so perfectly that I was okay with the way that they were executed. Likewise, I thought that the tone of the book was good. It had very serious moments. It had lighthearted moments. It had some great action, some great dialogue, but it balanced the tone so perfectly to be perfectly Trek. It was never over comedic. It was never over serious. It was never overly action-packed. It was never overly dialogue-heavy. It was the perfect Trek combination. That's partially because David Mack has so much experience in Trek, but also just because I think he just stumbled upon, like, this is the formula for how to write a good Trek novel. And you take out the Operation Vanguard stuff, which you could still have, you could copy, paste another fake, just come up with your own new operation something else, with the starbase something else, with the team from something else, and make the MacGuffin of the Vanguard series a different thing that's all made up. This is an excellent standalone novel. And it really is, even with the Operation Vanguard stuff, like, I wouldn't necessarily say, now read this, like, in between the Vanguard novels, necessarily. I would say, read this whenever you can, because it's a great standalone novel. And it pays things off in the end of the book that it sets up. It deals with all the character arcs properly. Now, there are a few characters who don't get much to do. Uhura doesn't really get anything to do in this book. Chekhov doesn't really get anything to do, and McCoy doesn't. Scotty gets a few moments, but it's not a lot. Kirk gets a few moments, but it's more towards the beginning. He's barely in it the rest of the book. But it's really Spock's book, and Sulu's tagging along. But even Sulu doesn't get a ton of time. It really is Spock's book in this book. And there are new characters and some other Enterprise characters that get some attention, and some characters from another ship who happen to be present, named Babbitts. They get some great moments in this book, and if you're not going to have McCoy, you need a wisecracking character who's going to criticize everything Spock does, and with a wisecracking attitude. And they have another doctor who does that, and she provides a similar humor to McCoy, but it's not exactly McCoy's energy. And so I quite enjoyed her character in the book as well. And I enjoyed all the Klingons. There was one Klingon, one of the Klingon commanders in this book. He has a line that is so deep, where he's talking about the importance of being a Klingon. And someone basically says, we need to just kill Kirk. Just kill him now. And he says, and he really wants to kill Kirk. The commander does. But he says, Klingons are all about honor. And we are all about glory, and we should strive for those things. But we have one other thing that is actually above those that we don't talk about, and that is duty, and duty has to come first. And when I read that quote, I was like, oh man, yes, a deep Klingon. And all of a sudden you realize not all Klingons are this kind of honor fighting. Like, some of them actually have real depth to them, and a lot of them do. And we get to see well-written Klingons. He's not saying honor's bad. He's not saying glory's bad. He's still a Klingon based off of those attributes. He's just saying, we have a duty to do, and that duty requires us not to kill Kirk right now. And I was like, yes, that is how you write Klingons. That is how you write three-dimensional Klingons in your story. And so I just thought he did a great job portraying Klingons. You know, the best two Klingon writers are Keith DeCandido and John Jackson Miller. They are the top. Like, no one else writes Klingons like them. David Mack's positioning himself to be my number 3 on that list of he's the third best. So I really thought he nailed the plot, the pacing, the themes, the tone, and the characters. All of it worked really, really well. If I have to say, like, make any particular, like, quibbles with the book, I'd say that the book doesn't have any POVs from the indigenous people of the planet that they visit in the book. They really should have. He should have had something from the indigenous people. Everything is from the Enterprise or the Klingons' perspective. We should have had something from the indigenous people. So that's one problem. Another little quibble is that you have the MacGuffin characters, but you never see that are in, like, the prologue. You never see their POV again for the rest of the book. It's all from the POV of the Enterprise and the Klingons characters. And there's a reason that Mac worked it this way, and it makes sense. But I think that we should have had more with them to connect with them, because they just felt flat because of that. But other than those two quibbles, I actually think this is an excellent, excellent book. And I really think this is one of the most entertaining books I've read of Star Trek this year. I still think that Articles of the Confederation and From History's Shadow are, like, better tie-in books, and they're better novels. But this is certainly up there as one of the most entertaining, and certainly proves that Star Trek can still produce some amazing books, and they still should, and you should still buy them because they are worth it. So that is my review of Star Trek Harm's Way by David Mack. I'm so excited for this book. I'm so excited to talk about it. I think that this rejuvenated my love of Star Trek. I was hitting a rut. Even though I was reading good Star Trek books, I wasn't reading amazing Star Trek books, and I hit a rut, and I was like, I need something to just jolt me back into reading Star Trek again. And this book did it, and I am so thankful. So if you've read Harm's Way, what did you think of the book? If you're interested in reading Harm's Way, let me know. If you have questions about the Vanguard series or anything else, let me know all those comments down in the comments section below. But until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.